What if I told you that the most reliable houses in the Wild West were not built of wood or stone, but of mud and grass? When the first settlers arrived on the Great Plains, they faced a harsh reality. There were no forests here to build the log cabins they were used to. Winter was approaching, and with it came icy winds and blizzards capable of freezing everything alive.
We will be all right.
In these conditions, an architecture of survival was born, simple but ingenious in its effectiveness. The pioneers did not conquer nature, but learned from it, literally going underground to escape its fury. They built houses that became part of the landscape, invisible to prying eyes and almost invulnerable to the elements. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why a turf roof was the best protection against the cold, how a single cow could heat an entire dwelling, and what simple secret allowed these shelters to remain warm even in the most severe cold. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the frontier, one that will completely change your perception of houses. The first thing to understand about dugouts and sod houses is that they were not just a cheap alternative to log cabins. They represented a completely different philosophy of housing, dictated by the very nature of the Great Plains. Here, in the vast expanses where trees were rare, the main building material was the earth itself. The dense grass-covered sod of the prairies was so strong that it could be cut into bricks like a cake. This material was free, lay right underfoot, and had unique properties. The idea was revolutionary for settlers from the wooded east. Not to build walls on the ground, but to cut them out of it or use it as the main element. They created dwellings that were literally an extension of a hill or meadow. Such a house did not resist the wind. It allowed the wind to rush over it. This approach required a complete rethinking of the concept of home. It ceased to be a separate object, alien to the landscape. It became an organic part of it, an almost invisible shelter, blending in with the environment. Psychologically, this was an important step. Instead of fighting the harsh land, the settlers accepted its rules. They sought protection not behind high walls, but under the cover of the earth, which gave them everything they needed to live. It was an architecture of humility and wisdom. The pioneers understood that this land could not be dominated. It could only be cooperated with. Their homes were not a symbol of conquest, but a symbol of adaptation. The construction of such a shelter did not begin with the foundation, but with the choice of the right location. The ideal option was the southern slope of a hill or ravine. This provided maximum sunlight and warmth in winter, as well as natural protection from the cold northern winds. The choice of slope also solved one of the main problems: drainage. The correct slope prevented rain and meltwater from flooding the dwelling. This was critical for keeping the interior dry and warm. Many shelters were hybrid. Part of the house was dug into the hillside, and the front wall and entrance were made of sod bricks. This allowed for windows and a door facing the open space. This type of dwelling was called a dugout. Another option was a detached house made entirely of sod, called a soddy. Its walls could be up to 1 meter thick, providing phenomenal insulation. In winter, such a house was warm, and in summer, it was cool. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about this approach to construction? Is it a sign of poverty or a brilliant adaptation to the conditions? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how a simple choice of hill could determine whether a family would survive the winter? Choosing a location for a future home was the most important decision a settler had to make. A mistake at this stage could be too costly, turning a shelter into a cold and damp trap. The first and most important rule was to find a south or southeast facing slope. This location offered two huge advantages. First, it provided protection from the prevailing north and northwest winds that carried the icy cold of the prairies. Second, the south-facing slope received maximum sunlight during the short winter days. The sun helped to warm the dwelling and dry the ground around the entrance. It was a free and completely reliable source of heat. The next most important factor was the soil. Settlers looked for dense, loamy soil that would not crumble when dug up. Sandy or rocky soil was completely unsuitable for building a dugout. The ideal location was considered to be a hillside near a stream or river, but high enough to avoid flooding. Water was necessary for life and construction, but its excess was the main enemy of underground dwellings. Good drainage was the key to dryness and comfort. Before starting work, the pioneer carefully examined the chosen site. He checked how rainwater drained away and whether there were any springs nearby that could wash away the walls. Sometimes it took several days to find the perfect site. In addition, the strategic component was also taken into account. The house had to be located so that it offered a good view of the surrounding area. This made it possible to notice the approach of uninvited guests or predators in time. Equally important was the availability of pasture for livestock and land for a vegetable garden. The farm had to be within walking distance. Therefore, the ideal location was a complex solution that took into account all aspects of survival. Once the location was chosen, the layout of the future dwelling began. Usually, it was a simple rectangle, the size of which depended on the family composition. A standard dugout rarely exceeded 3 by 4 meters. The right choice of location turned a simple hole in the ground into a cozy and safe shelter. The earth itself became a protector, sheltering from wind and frost. This symbiosis between man and landscape was the key to survival in the harsh conditions of the frontier. But even a perfectly located house was vulnerable to one of the most terrible disasters of the prairies. In the next chapter, you will learn how the construction of a sod roof saved people not only from the cold, but also from the element of fire. You've definitely never heard about this unique secret. The roof was the most complex and important part of the underground shelter. Its design determined whether the house would be dry, warm, and safe, because it was the roof that took the brunt of the elements. Wooden beams or rafters served as the basis for the roof. Wood was in short supply on the Great Plains. Settlers had to travel tens or even hundreds of kilometers to the nearest river, where willows or poplars grew. These logs were not particularly strong or durable, so they were laid as thickly as possible. A layer of branches, brushwood, or thick bark, if it could be found, was laid on top of the rafters. This layer had to support the enormous weight of the sod. Next came the most important stage, on which the thermal insulation properties of the roof depended. A layer of tall, dry prairie grass was laid on top of the branches. It created an air gap that acted as modern insulation. And now it was time for the main component, the sod. It was cut into large layers using a special plow or manually with a shovel. These layers were heavy and durable, permeated by a dense network of roots. The first layer of sod was laid with the roots facing up, the grass facing down. This created a dense, almost waterproof surface. The soil and roots were compressed, forming a reliable barrier against moisture. Then a second layer was laid, but this time with the roots down and the grass up. This layer was alive. The grass on it continued to grow, and its roots sprouted into the lower layer, intertwining into a single monolithic carpet. This two-layer construction was an ingenious solution. It provided excellent thermal insulation, keeping the house warm in winter and cool in summer. The thickness of such a roof could reach half a meter. Moreover, the living roof was completely fireproof. When a fiery tornado swept across the prairie, destroying everything in its path, the dugout houses remained intact. The green grass on the roof simply did not burn. The only drawback of such a roof was leaks. In the first year or two, until the roots had grown together tightly enough, the roof could leak during heavy rains. But over time, it only became stronger and more reliable. What you are about to learn will change your perception of construction. Looking at these reliable shelters, one might think that a complex arsenal of tools was required to create them. But the reality was much harsher and at the same time impressive. The average settler had an extremely limited set of tools that he brought with him in his wagon. Most often it consisted of an axe, a shovel, a pickaxe, and possibly a handsaw. There was no question of specialized construction tools. The main tool for building a dugout was a simple but reliable bayonet shovel. It was used to remove tons of earth, forming the walls and floor of the future house. It was exhausting physical labor that could take weeks. A special plow was used to cut sod bricks, if the farm had one. But most often this work was done manually with the same shovel. It took considerable skill to cut layers of equal thickness and size. An axe was invaluable for cutting the few wooden elements that were needed. It was used to chop beams for the roof, support posts, and carve door frames. Every piece of wood was worth its weight in gold. Sometimes a hand drill or a gimlet was available. It was used to make holes for connecting wooden parts, but most often they did without nails, using grooves and wedges. The settlers had no measuring instruments, except perhaps a rope with knots. Everything was done by eye, relying on experience and intuition. Surprisingly, with such primitive technology, they managed to create perfectly straight walls and sturdy structures. The only technology at their disposal was the pulling power of oxen or horses. They were used to transport logs and to work with a plow. But most of the work was done by human hands. This minimalism in tools forced the pioneers to be as inventive as possible. They learned to use every resource to its fullest. Every knot, every suitable stone was put to use. The simplicity of the tools dictated the simplicity of the forms. That is why most dugouts were simple rectangles without any architectural frills. Form followed function and available technology. Ready to find out how this hole in the ground became a livable space? When the main excavation was complete, the interior finishing stage began. The bare earthen walls had to be reinforced and made more livable. Not only the comfort, but also the safety of the inhabitants depended on this. First, the walls were carefully leveled with a shovel. All irregularities were removed, and roots and stones were uprooted. The surface had to be as smooth as possible. Then the walls were often burned. A fire was lit and allowed to walk across the entire surface. This made the soil harder and prevented it from crumbling. The next step was plastering. A mixture of clay, water, and chopped grass, which acted as a reinforcing material, was prepared. This mixture was applied to the walls in several layers. As it dried, the clay formed a strong and smooth crust. It did not allow moisture from the ground to pass through and prevented dust from entering the room. The dwelling immediately became cleaner and tidier. For additional finishing, the walls could be whitewashed. Lime was an affordable and inexpensive material. Whitewashed walls not only looked more aesthetically pleasing, but also made a dark room much brighter by reflecting light from the window or the hearth. For greater comfort, the floor was covered with dry grass, reed mats, or animal skins. In more affluent homes, wooden floors could be laid, but this was very rare in the early years of land development. The interior space was extremely simple. Furniture was often made from materials at hand, boxes, boards, or dug directly into the walls. Niches in the clay walls served as shelves for dishes and storage. Are you ready to learn how a single square meter of glass could completely change life in the underground? One of the main problems with dugouts was the lack of light and fresh air. Solving these problems required no less ingenuity than building walls and roofs. The only source of natural light was usually a single, small window. It was located on the front wall, which was not dug into the ground next to the door. Glass was an incredibly expensive and fragile commodity, so few could afford it. Most often, the window opening was covered with oiled paper or cloth. Such a double-glazed window let in a little dim light, but did not protect well from the cold. At night, it had to be closed with wooden shutters or simply plugged with rags. The door was also an important element. They tried to make it as strong and massive as possible so that it could withstand the pressure of the wind. It was assembled from boards, if available, or woven from branches and coated with clay. Ventilation was a matter of life and death. In a small enclosed space where food was cooked over an open fire or using a small stove, carbon monoxide quickly accumulated. An improperly constructed chimney could lead to tragedy. The hearth or stove was usually located near one of the walls. The chimney was made of stones coated with clay, or a simple pipe was used. It was very important to ensure good draft so that the smoke went outside and not into the room. For additional ventilation, a small hole could be made in the roof or wall. It was plugged for the winter and kept open during the warm season. This allowed air to circulate and get rid of dampness. The interior layout was as open as possible. There were no partitions so as not to interfere with the circulation of air and light. The entire space was one large room. Despite all the tricks, it was dim inside the dugout. Precious candles or oil lamps were lit only in the evenings. During the day, the main sources of light were the open door and a small window. This constant semi-darkness and lack of fresh air were the main price to pay for the safety and warmth that the underground dwelling provided. But for people on the threshold of a harsh winter, it was an acceptable compromise. Would you like to live in such a house? In the next chapter, you will learn how the pioneers solved the problem of heating when there was almost no firewood. Heating a dugout in conditions of firewood shortage was a real art. A classic wood-burning stove or fireplace was a luxury that was inaccessible to most settlers on the treeless plains. They had to look for alternative sources of fuel. The main fuel on the prairies was kisyak, dried buffalo dung, and later domestic cow dung. It was collected in the summer, formed into briquettes, and stacked for drying. These briquettes burned slowly and gave off a lot of heat. The smell of this fuel was distinctive, but people quickly got used to it. When survival was at stake, such trifles were ignored. Kisyak was free, and its reserves were practically inexhaustible. Sometimes bundles of tall prairie grass, twisted into tight bundles, were used as fuel. They burned quickly, but gave off enough heat to boil water or cook food. This was a good addition to the dung. The very design of the house helped to conserve heat. The thick earthen walls and roof had enormous thermal inertia. They heated up slowly, but also cooled down very slowly, smoothing out daily temperature fluctuations. Even the heat emitted by the inhabitants themselves was not wasted. It was accumulated by the walls and then slowly released back into the room. In a small space, this made a noticeable contribution to the overall temperature balance. Sometimes a completely exotic method of heating was used. If a cattle shed was adjacent to the dugout, the heat emitted by the animals was partially transferred to the living quarters. One cow could provide as much heat as a small heater. The stoves were small and very efficient. Most often, they were simple cast iron bourgeois that required a minimum of fuel. They were valued like gold and carried from place to place. Thanks to all these factors, it was possible to maintain a comfortable temperature inside the dugout, even in the most severe frosts. When a blizzard raged outside and the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees, it was relatively warm and cozy inside. Life in the dugout was extremely simple and harsh. The entire living space was concentrated in one room, where there was no place for privacy. Every member of the family was constantly in view. Sleeping places were arranged along the walls. These could be simple plank beds or simply trampled areas of the floor covered with straw mattresses and skins. Everything was designed to save as much space as possible. Cooking took place right there, on a hearth or small stove. Smoke and the smell of food constantly hung in the air. This was an integral part of the atmosphere of an underground dwelling. Storing supplies was a serious problem. Some of the food was stored in niches dug into the walls. To protect it from rodents, they were covered with wooden shutters. Often, a small cellar was dug next to the dugout. Vegetables, salted meat, and dairy products were stored there. In winter, such a cellar did not freeze, ensuring the preservation of supplies. Water was brought from the nearest stream or well and stored in wooden buckets. It had to be used sparingly. Washing and laundry were rare and laborious tasks. Despite the cramped conditions and domestic inconveniences, these houses had their own unique atmosphere. Families were very close-knit because they were completely dependent on each other. On long winter evenings, they would gather around the fire, do needlework, repair tools, or just talk. It was a life reduced to the bare essentials. There was nothing superfluous. Every item had its purpose. And in this simplicity, there was a harsh harmony. One of the less obvious but important advantages of a dugout was its invisibility. A house sunk into a hillside and covered with growing grass was virtually impossible to spot from a distance. It blended into the landscape, becoming a natural part of it. This camouflage provided a sense of security. In turbulent times when not always friendly groups roamed the prairies, the ability to remain unnoticed was invaluable. Smoke from the chimney was the only thing that could betray the presence of the dwelling. In addition, the dugout was a real fortress, capable of withstanding any weather conditions. Hurricane-force winds, which easily blew away light wooden structures, simply swept over the low-lying house, which was embedded in the ground. Neither storms nor tornadoes could harm it. Summer thunderstorms with hail could not damage the thick turf roof either. It provided reliable protection from any precipitation. It was a shelter that gave absolute confidence in its reliability. Even prairie fires, the main disaster of the prairies, were not frightening to the inhabitants of dugouts. The fire passed over the surface without affecting the dwelling hidden underground. It was the only structure that could guarantee salvation from the fiery element. The structure was also resistant to minor ground shifts. The earthen walls were flexible enough to withstand certain deformations without collapsing. It was a simple but very reliable engineering solution. For a settler who found himself alone with wild and unpredictable nature, this feeling of security was critically important. The house was not just a place to sleep, but a real bastion, the center of his small world. Here he could feel completely safe. We can see that the pioneers' underground shelters were not just primitive burrows, but the result of a deep understanding of the laws of nature and brilliant engineering ingenuity. In conditions where there were no familiar building materials, the earth itself became the walls, the roof, and the main protector from icy winds and winter storms. These modest, almost invisible dwellings allowed an entire generation of people to survive and settle in the harsh expanses of the Great Plains. They were a temporary solution, but it was this solution that made further exploration of the frontier possible. The history of sod houses and dugouts is a vivid example of how human ingenuity can turn the greatest difficulties into unique opportunities. What other forgotten technologies from the past do you think could be useful today? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next historical investigations.